This Week in Radio Tech, episode 143, is brought to you by the Telos Alliance. Hey, get your gorgeous and info-packed Now catalog. You can download it, or we'll ship you one for free at telosalliance.com/now.
And now, our feature presentation.
Twert.
Hurricane Sandy just left, and dozens of broadcasters say, good riddance. Well, what's in Sandy's wake? Well, let's talk about it.
All right, calm down. He says that to everyone.
This calls for immediate discussion.
What's up, Doc?
All your days are belong to us.
From his palatial office of important business,
or in a choice hotel in a distant land,
this is Kirk Harnack.
Legendary industry reporter Scott Fybush joins Chris Tobin and me on episode 143 of Twert.
You're dialed in to This Week in Radio Tech.
Hey, it's time for This Week in Radio Tech. I'm Kirk Harnack, and you have tuned into my favorite show. This is the show where we talk about radio technology, and that covers a huge variety of things, from emergency preparedness to audio quality, dealing with vinyl, turntables, styli, CD players, digital playback systems, and recording systems. Once in a while, we even have to deal with some audio tape. And then we get to go to the transmitter site and deal with all the things out there, the things that it takes to get a signal to the masses. Now, despite the popularity of the interwebs and digital TV, radio is still listened to every week by something like 97% of the population. People spend hours and hours every week with the radio on average. And so, hey, as engineers, we're charged with keeping all that working. And we talk about it here on This Week in Radio Tech. Well, on this episode, I got a chance to interview a guy who's really in touch with radio in the northeast part of the U.S. His name is Scott Fybush, and Scott does a lot of reporting on the side about what's going on where. He's up to date usually on towers, tower sites, transmitter operations, stations moving from one place to another. And so without further ado, well, I guess I better tell you, this episode of This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by my friends at my employer, Telos, and the Telos Zip 1 IP audio codec. I'd encourage you to go to the Telos website, that's telos-systems.com, and check it out, the Zip 1. So let's now get to our interview with Scott Fybush. Go ahead and roll it. Hey, I'm Kirk Harnack along with Scott Fybush. Scott has been a fairly regular contributor on This Week in Radio Tech. We're glad to have him on. We'll have him on again before the end of the year, actually. I'd like to have him on the whole show. But right now, Scott had a few minutes to talk to us about broadcasting in the Northeast and how it's been affected by Hurricane Sandy. First of all, Scott, welcome into the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And good to have you on. So, Scott, a lot of folks know that you have a website, Northeast Radio Watch, and you keep up with broadcasting, especially in the Northeast, and especially radio broadcasting, all kinds of news, technical news, and folks moving around, and tower information and such. So, first of all, Hurricane Sandy, huge tropical storm, and we've been inundated with the news that it's caused. So why don't you tell us from a broadcasting point of view, a tower point of view, signal getting on the air here and there point of view, what do you know about what broadcasters have been faced with and what they're doing about it in Hurricane Sandy?
The good news is, so far, at least as we record this on Wednesday afternoon, there's only one tower that I've heard of anyway that actually suffered damage from this. It was the middle tower of a 3-tower array up in Rockland County, WRCR. The middle tower there, I just saw some pictures. That got bent over. However, everything else, at least tower-wise, appears for now to be okay. And I'm not sure how long it's going to end up being the case, because there's a lot that we don't know yet. You see those pictures of the devastation along the coast, especially in New Jersey, and clearly we're going to hear of more damage than we've heard of so far. But the big issue so far for broadcasters has been loss of power. In a lot of areas, when you have 6 million people without power, you're going to have a lot of radio stations without power, not just at the transmitter end, but at the studio end, too. And we can talk about some of the effects on Lower Manhattan. And then the other issue has been high water levels. You know, most of the New York City AM towers are in the New Jersey Meadowlands. And it's a low-lying swamp area, and when that water rushes in, as it's been doing to record levels, it starts rising up above tower bases. And so most of those AM stations there, especially Sunday night, Monday, those stations, a lot of them were off the air simply because the tower bases had been overtopped. And obviously with AM, if your insulator's overtopped, you're out of luck for a while. The good news even there is that most of those buildings were up high enough that it appears so far that most of them, I think, have escaped damage. But there were some big stations that were off the air for a while.
I understand that one of the stations, I believe it was one of the CBS stations, WINS, W-I-N-S, they're at 1010 on the AM dial, that, I heard that they actually had some water damage to a transmitter, but the word transmitter may have been used rather generically, and it may have been, in fact, overtopping a tower bases. But I understand that 1010 WINS ended up transmitting their news format at a different location.
Two different locations, actually. CBS was trying to figure out what was going to happen to their AM sites in New York. They have 2 AM sites in New York. One of them is on High Island, which is off City Island, which in turn is off the Bronx. Right in Long Island Sound, right in the path of the storm. And I think the expectation going in was that that was the site that was really going to get hammered as Long Island Sound rose. And then 1010 WINS is over in the Meadowlands in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. And it's a 4-tower array that's down in a swamp, but still fairly well elevated. So they had plans going into this with the 3 AMs to put them on their 3 FM stations. So they could at least keep running Sunday night into Monday, depending on what happened out at High Island. And what ended up happening was that High Island stayed on the air. I think from what I've heard, the water got up on the island, but it didn't get to the bottom of the tower base. So they were able to keep going from High Island. That 1010 WINS site, however, apparently got water up over the tower bases. I haven't seen any pictures yet. Our friend Tom Ray was driving by there on Monday after spending the night at his WOR site nearby. And he said that at the Route 17 exit onto Toledo Avenue, where the towers are, that the water over the road was about 4 feet deep, to give you an idea what they were dealing with there. So they got knocked out there. They originally had put 1010 WINS on 101.1 WCBS FM, thinking that was, that's probably their most valuable FM station. They thought that'll be the one we disrupt the least. Turned out 1010 WINS was the one that was going to be off the most. They ended up moving it to another one of their FM frequencies, to 92.3, where it displaced 92.3 now, their top 40 station. And it is still there at the moment. They were off the air on 1010 WINS until Tuesday afternoon. They're back at last report at low power. I suspect, although I haven't heard for sure, they're probably just up on one of those towers, non-directional, I would guess, but I haven't heard anything confirmed from them just yet.
I was talking to Tom Ray, and he's been posting on Facebook as well about his adventure in keeping the WOR transmitter going. Of course, they've been on generator power since the power went out there. Now he did not have to stay at the transmitter site itself.
Right, the hotel right around the corner there.
Yeah, hotel nearby, but the hotel's had been without power. I don't know if it's back on now, but he certainly at least spent most of the night there without any power in the hotel room. But I guess better a warm bed than a cold transmitter shack. So in the New York area, that's what you know. Do you know anything about either farther north or farther south toward Philly and into New Jersey? What the situation's been?
Yeah, a little bit. The big issue all the way along that whole stretch of coast there has all been power issues more than anything else for broadcasters. That's been an issue for New York too. Most of those New York City stations moved their studios from Midtown Manhattan, where they had been for decades, and within probably the last 8 or 10 years, just about everybody has moved down to Lower Manhattan, below 31st Street, where there has not been power since Sunday. So that's been a real challenge. I know Tom's had some difficulties with the WOR network, originating programming. He had no phone lines. A lot of those central offices in Lower Manhattan lost power too, so there was no phone service. Tom had an emergency studio set up out of the WOR site, and I know he's had some people out there running programming, but that's been a real challenge, just trying to keep the studios up and running. Power's been an issue elsewhere too. WICC in Bridgeport, Connecticut. You've probably seen pictures of those 2 big self-supporting towers that are out on the beach, out on the sandy spit of land in Long Island Sound across from Bridgeport.
Okay.
They survived. The towers made it. The 3-phase power out there is gone and won't be back for a while. And the propane tanks, which were attached to the side of the building, got ripped off the side of the building.
Oh my goodness! The propane tanks just gone.
There are pictures. Paul Thirst's Engineering Radio blog. Maybe we can put a link up to it. I think it's engineeringradio.us. He's got pictures up on there of what happened, and these enormous steel propane tanks just got tossed off the side of the building and tossed down the beach. So he's working, I think probably by the time this airs, he'll have propane back out there and can fire up the generator again. But it's yet another thing to think about in emergency preparedness. Not just do I have a generator, do I have a fuel source for that generator that can survive 100-mile-an-hour winds blowing past my transmitter site? So that, on top of everything else, has been a challenge for them to deal with. The good news so far is that once you get out to Philadelphia and once you get up into farther eastern New England, that after the worst of this passed, that for the most part, if you've got a way to power things, you're able to be back in business. The devastation was not so bad. The other piece of very good news, if you remember the aftermath of Irene last year, where that storm really kept going north up the Hudson Valley and up into New England after it made its initial hit, and it dumped huge quantities of water that created massive flooding up in Vermont and up in the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York. That didn't happen this year, at least not so far. And so those areas which were bracing for a repeat, and some of them haven't even fully recovered from last year, so far they appear to have dodged a bullet, we think.
What about, we've seen reports of really heavy snowfall farther inland in West Virginia, most especially. Have you heard of any tower issues there? Now, the snowfall may, hopefully it wasn't preceded by icing conditions, and that's oftentimes what brings down towers is heavy icing, and snowfall itself, not so much. Heard anything about that?
I haven't. I hate to say that it's been a blessing that we've had so much of this devastating weather in the last couple of years, but I think a lot of these older, vulnerable towers that were going to come down in one of these, in a lot of cases in the last couple of years, they've already been hit by it. And if they were going to go, in a lot of cases, maybe they've already gone. I don't keep as careful track of West Virginia. I certainly haven't heard anything much from Pennsylvania or from Ohio. I know they're dealing with tremendous power outages now. Up in the Cleveland area, we're hearing about. But so far, I think you're right. I think the lack of that icing, the fact that most of this has fallen as fairly frozen snow to begin with, has been, saved some of these towers at least.
Broadcasters, especially in the New York area, have gone to great lengths to make sure that they have backup power at the studio in so many cases. Even though, Con Ed that serves Manhattan is usually, they have a lot of redundancy themselves. But when you get this kind of storm, my goodness, what can you do? A lot of us saw that video footage of a power station or something burning up, blowing up. Sending some really, really bright lights in the sky that night during Sandy. And I would imagine that the stations that you mentioned have backup power, but you can't control when you don't have backup telephone service. You're depending on some outside third party, which is normally very reliable. And if they're not there, then if you haven't built other systems, other independent systems, RF-based perhaps, then you're not going to go anywhere with your signal.
Which is a huge challenge if you think about it. If you have studios that are deep in the canyons of lower Manhattan, for the most part, you're not getting a line of sight path from any of those studios over to the New Jersey Meadowlands. You could loop it up through Empire if you had to. And Empire, that perhaps is another one of the take a deep breath and be thankful moments of this whole thing, is that Empire apparently never lost power in any of this, because those Empire sites, because of the age of that building, for the most part, do not have generators.
Okay.
And that is most of the TV in town, nearly all of the FM in town. And so at least those signals for the most part stayed up. But yeah, it was a huge challenge. There were stations that even if the phone service went out, even if they still had ways to stay on the air, there are people down in lower Manhattan making use of 5.8 unlicensed as backups if they have to, because the distances that you're dealing with are not huge, at least.
A lot of the broadcasters in New York have backup sites at 4 Times Square. Yeah. I've gotten the tour of that site. It's absolutely gorgeous. Do you know if 4 Times Square has backup power?
It does. That site was designed after 9/11. Those guys went through and they rebuilt that thing to be bulletproof. And so there is backup power there. One of the big things, one of the big concerns that some of the stations in lower Manhattan had was that even if the generator was on an upper floor, a lot of times the fuel tank feeding the generator wasn't. And you start getting water down in the sub-basements and basements of these buildings. So that's a challenge. And, of course, the challenge of getting people to these facilities to broadcast at all. who anticipated the entire subway system of Manhattan would be knocked out, that there would be no cabs. There are people driving around Manhattan who would never drive around Manhattan, except that they've got to get to a station to get on the air. I think you're going to see some new analysis, as good as some of these emergency plans were. A storm like this creates a whole new set of, wow, we need to think about that next time too.
I don't know how you plan for something like this. What do you? I guess you got to get everything you possibly can under your own control, and sometimes that's either not possible or it's really expensive. And I don't know where you draw the line. Where do you say, you know what, if we get another one of these storms again in 10, 15, 20 years or next year, are we really going to spend, I don't know, $100,000 now to prep for this, or whatever it may be to try to be independent of anybody that could knock you off? Would you build better studio facilities maybe at your transmitter site? And
when those transmitter sites are as low-lying as they are too, is that where you want to be necessarily?
Yeah, well, that's true. And then for people like WOR and their satellite network, what do you plan on having a backup facility somewhere? People like Sirius and XM, they do have backup sites.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. Clear Channel, and I have not found out yet if it got used, but Clear Channel actually has a backup studio facility in New Jersey, which is at the old Z100 studios in the Meadowlands. And I haven't heard yet from the guys there, and that would be an interesting thing to find out, and I'm trying to find out if that got used at all. I know they lost power at their main studios in the old AT&T building on 6th Avenue. I know they were without power for a while there on Monday, but I do not know if they ended up having to move things over. I know they also do a lot of their own telephone there. They actually roll a lot of their own phone service out of that location. So it may be that they were able to keep phone lines up and stay on the air from there. But that's not a bad idea if there's some other location somewhere, even if it's outside the market necessarily. If there's some other location where you can get something on the air and bring it back to your transmitters, if you're a big enough company to be able to afford to do it, what's it worth to you to stay on the air?
Actually, I do know that Clear Channel in particular has made a lot of plans and put people on this and spent money on contingency for out-of-market broadcasting, and a lot of that came along after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. They put some plans together. I'm not tied in with Clear Channel closely. I don't know what exactly they've had, but some friends of mine I know were involved with planning and deploying and marshaling resources during Katrina and planning for all that as a contingency afterwards.
I know you've had Charlie Wooten on the show before, and he's definitely involved in that down there.
Yep, he and I think Mike Gideon from here in Nashville also was too. Scott, I appreciate your update very, very much. I want to, of course, ask you about the calendar because that's a great resource. But before I do, is there anything else that concerning Sandy and during or post that comes to mind that you want to talk about?
That's really the big thing. There are some stations out there that deserve a great amount of praise, even if they weren't necessarily the areas that ended up getting hit the worst, just solely for being prepared for it. Out on the end of Long Island, WLNG, that great oldies and community service station out there, they stayed on the air with water rising up, literally over their feet in the studio. And they were still on the air out there as long as they could be on Sunday. They had a backup plan to move to higher ground. And WDEV up in Vermont, where they got hit so badly by the remnants of Irene last year, they stayed on the air live all night, and that was an amazing thing that they did there. So they probably deserve some praise for that too. And of course, the other thing we didn't mention was TV simulcasts. Mm-hmm. As a last ditch, if you can't get your own programming on the air, and WOR, for example, couldn't do that for a big chunk of Monday, if you at least have an affiliation with a TV station, you can at least get something on the air. And that's what WOR was doing most of the day Monday. It's a big deal when people don't have battery-powered DTV receivers and you got 6 million people without power. That's a service you can provide too, if nothing else.
I just noticed earlier today that radioinfo.com has a piece about Walter Sabo, who's a consultant and a brilliant radio idea man, according to Radio Info. I would have to agree. He lives in Manhattan, and Walter gives high praise to Clear Channel CHR outlet Z100 as providing great coverage during the emergency. So Good on Z100, and thanks.
Yeah, I'll tell you honestly, I was listening, mostly being up here 400 miles away. I had WCBS on through most of it because it's the signal that gets up here. But yeah, I've heard good things about what they did there.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing for AM. It does provide that ground coverage for quite a long ways. So, hey, let's wrap it up. Tell us about your calendar. You do this. You've done this for years. This amazing, beautiful, geeky calendar. I love it.
There it is. It is finally back from the printer. That is Sandia Crest in Albuquerque on the cover there this year.
Oh, I've been there. Me
too. I'm still short of breath, I think, as a result of it. Up it was 10,600 feet or so. We have the spiral binding as a standard feature this year. Enough people like that last year. And another neat thing this year is we actually, for the first time in 12 years of doing this, have a new page design this year. So there's a little more color in there, and a few more notable holidays, and of course all the great pictures that you've come to enjoy on the Tower site calendar. There it goes, Durango, Colorado, 2 a.m.s by the train tracks there.
Oh yeah.
There are a whole bunch of new pictures and some great stuff in there. It is shipping now.
So if folks want to get a hold of this calendar, give 1 for a gift, give 10 for a gift. This, if you're an engineering manager for several stations, and you want to get a cool, appropriate, and slightly geeky gift for guys that work for you or with you, this is a great idea. Where do folks go to get that calendar?
They can go right to store.fybush.com, and they are available now.
And if you just go to fybush.com, I would imagine there's a link there too.
There are several links that will get you right there too.
Fybush is spelled.
We have bulk rates too. If you want to give them as corporate gifts, we'll get you hooked up with that.
Fybush is spelled Fybush.
Yes.
Fybush.com. Scott, thanks for giving us this update. Appreciate. I know you're busy on the day that we're actually doing Torch, so thanks for taking a few moments today to.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Happy to join you.
All right, I guess I'm back on. Hey, this is Kirk on This Week in Radio Tech. We're doing the show at a special time this week due to a conflict on my end. I want to bring in a couple of co-hosts. My regular co-host is Chris Tobin, best-dressed engineer in radio from New York City. Hey, Chris, are you there?
I'm here, Kirk. I think.
All right.
Yes, I am.
Good.
Yep, I'm here. Nice and dry.
You've been busy. We're going to get to that in just a minute. We also have a guest on our show today, a guy who's been very active in the chat room, and I've learned a lot from him. He always throws up something that is worth really chewing on. Gets your brain wrapped around it, and that's Mike Phillips. Hey, Mike, how are you?
That makes me an irregular co-host.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, I don't know much about you. Why don't you spend 30 seconds to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you have something to do with radio?
I grew up in the business. My father built a radio station in 1961, signed on the air in January 2nd, 1962. I grew up in the business, took over, ran it, and starting in 1970, got out of it in 1984, and it's something that just never gets out of your blood.
Well, now you've been out of it since '84, and yet you are really pretty up to date on technology in broadcasting. Why is that? What are you doing to keep yourself involved?
I'm an equipment junkie. I mean, I love equipment. I love broadcast equipment. I've built production rooms. I've built actually the radio station we used to own is still using the production console that I built from scratch. And I put transmitters on the air, built control rooms. I never did understand how to do neat wiring, but it always worked, so that was my excuse. But once it's in your blood, it never gets out of your blood. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's I love it, and I've kind of had my interest reinvigorated lately because of internet broadcasting, because of working with Andrew and things like the Twerd Show and Leo and so forth. So it's kind of like a second shot at it for me.
We're going to hear from Chris Tobin here in just a minute about what's been happening in New York City radio, because Chris is right in the heart of it in Manhattan, and I don't know if Chris has had power or not. We'll find out in a minute. But I wanted to pass along a comment, because, Mike, you mentioned that once radio gets in your blood, you can't get rid of it. And something that I have noticed about myself, my own self, in thinking about systems that must keep working, thinking about a sense of urgency, and that growing up in radio, dead air is a terrible thing, whether it's caused by something wrong in the studio, the disc jockey falling asleep, or being out or locking himself out of the building, or the transmitter going off. And so if there's a period of time when there's dead air, we engineers, I anyway, tend to get very nervous, like tend to spring to action. Oh my gosh, there's a problem. We got to get back on the air, because that was always ingrained in me. Of course, the phone at stations, oftentimes the phone will start ringing if you're off the air. Hey, what happened to y'all? You know, that doesn't happen on the internet. On the internet, well, sure, people will write an email to support or something, but you know, if I don't know, if Amazon doesn't work for 5 minutes, you know, I'm sure there are people working on it, but maybe I can say it this way: I've hired people from the computer industry to work in radio, and I must say they have lacked a sense of urgency about getting a problem fixed, and also, to some degree, lacked a sense of backup plans. If something doesn't work, let's have an immediate failover contingency. Now, I know that can vary a lot from one, you know, IT scenario to another, but for broadcasters, it just seems to be, you know, ingrained. We got to have a backup plan, and so that's the part of it that doesn't get out of your blood. This sense of continuity in the broadcast that's got to be there all the time. That's my thought on it. Chris Tobin, how you doing in New York City today?
Doing well, actually. I took a trip downtown below 39th Street, from east to west of Manhattan Island is without power. Some pockets of power here and there, but I'm sure it's just very, very isolated. Very strange feeling to take a transit bus downtown to the east side, East Houston Street, and then walk west on Houston, only to see a few cars coming and going. Now, mind you, this is a 4-lane, 2 lanes in both direction roadway. It connects the east to west side, Holland Tunnel on the west side, FDR Drive on the east, and typically a lot of commercial traffic. Now, no traffic lights are on, so there's, you know, you're at your own mercy crossing the streets, and just a few cars here and there, a couple of cabs. But the sound of portable generators is what you hear. I'm walking along, and I'm like, what is that sound? And almost every subway entrance, there are portable generators running electrical wires down into the subway. I'm assuming that's for transit workers to get lights and to continue pumping out the water and some of the tunnels and stations, and just, you know, checking track inspections. And there are some restaurants who have been able to get a portable generator for some lighting. The gas is still working, so they're able to run the stoves. So they're making coffee and hot food, and a couple of restaurants are open. And it's been interesting. It's you know, it's not something you normally see on a Thursday afternoon here in New York City. But all of downtown, no lights. I mean, stores are closed.
So I was actually a little worried about you when I heard about the power being off south of 34th Street. You just said 39th, but whichever it is. So your power didn't go off for an extended period of time.
No. I'm in a part of Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, that the electrical services were not impacted by flooding of manholes or transformers being hit by the rivers either west or east side. However, there are parts of Upper East Side Manhattan in the 70s and 80s where the FDR Drive, which is on the east side of Manhattan, and the East River met. So the FDR Drive was no longer drivable, but if you had a boat or a canoe or a dinghy, you could definitely go up and down the FDR. That made it across York Avenue, which is the first avenue on the very far east end of Manhattan Island, and managed to get into backyards, or not backyards, I should say, curbside transformers that provide power to the apartments. So I know several people, friends of mine, who were without power for 2 or 3 days. And the river was just outside the window.
Hey, one more question I want to ask before we bring Mike Phillips back in here, and that is, when you have a situation where water and electricity meet. Now, we all know that water, generally in all situations, will short out electricity, and hopefully there are circuit breakers and fuses and things like that in the electrical power grid that keep things from burning up too badly. But how dry does stuff have to get before the utility can start reapplying power? If you've got a transformer that was underwater for a while and it's in a cabinet, could there not be still seawater in that cabinet? How do they go about turning stuff back on? And I would imagine there's some surprises when they turn some stuff back on.
Well, what they typically will do, I've worked with the folks at the New York City OEM, the City Hall, and sat in meetings to understand how utility companies, in this case New York City's utility companies, Con Edison, how they manage it. In many cases, They go out to places, they have records of where their transformers, and they look to see if the casings have been breached. If they have been, they just basically replace the transformer. They don't even bother trying to figure it out. In the case of what just took place with Sandy, most transformers, when they were hit by the salty or brackish water from the East River and the Hudson, the transformers disintegrated or exploded open. So it was obvious that what they had to do. Manholes, they dry out as best they can, but manholes have a little moisture in them. They have ways around it, but they don't just turn things back on, so to speak, willy-nilly. And there are huge breakers at the substations. You'll probably see them when you drive around the country, but if you ever see what looks like a large T-shaped device that has a pole, think of the vertical position as the vertical pole, and then a horizontal on top of it, and it looks like it swivels. Those are the huge grid breakers, and they're designed to when there's a short circuit, if you will, they're designed to break the circuit. They spin, and the time it takes to come back around, they hope that the momentary short circuit on the grid is gone, and they reconnect. If it continues, I think, twice or 3 times, then it just stays open, and all the alarms go off and everything like that. So there's a lot of safety mechanisms in place. It's just that when you have the step-down transformers, they blow up. That's pretty much it. At that point, just rebuild it, replace it, and go from there. That takes time.
Mike, you are a guy that seems to have an opinion on everything, and I appreciate that. What? Give me some of your thoughts about preparation for a storm like Sandy. Living in North Carolina, that's where you are, right? You've been through a number of storms, and while you were a broadcaster.
Yeah, and one of the first things that comes to my mind is that I don't know how it is in your markets, Kirk, but in our market, the competition was vicious. I mean, it was downright ugly from time to time. But when there was a disaster of this magnitude, if something comes along and it comes down to an engineering matter, all bets were off. Everybody got along. There were times when I was the only engineer in town, my competitor would call me and have to, hat in hand, ask me if I would help them. And I always would. If there was a part that they needed or vice versa, that would always work through. So that part of it added at least some civility between the competitors. And other things that would happen along the way is, as far as this business getting into your blood, and I guess you and Chris would probably agree, that whereas we don't like having to deal with the urgency of the matter, there is something that causes adrenaline to rush whenever you've got to get on the air. It's kind of like the dead air thing you're talking about, Kirk. It's in your blood. You've got to get it on. The station has to be on the air, and you'll do whatever it takes, take as many hours as you need, and so it just has to be done. And it's a challenge when you hit that plate button and the transmitter comes on, and all of a sudden you're back on the air. So that part of it is gratifying to some degree. As far as preparation is concerned, a lot of it has to do with how much money is available to the station. I'm from small market radio. We didn't have the money to go out and buy locomotive-sized generators. We had to do things like go to the Army surplus office and find a 15,000, 20,000 watt generator that we could find someone who understood diesel engines and generators to come in and hook it up and wire it into the switch so we could go on the air with it, and did that, and we're very successful with it. Other preparations, you'd have to think about what you can grab from the local hardware store. What did Radio Shack have? What's in your junk box that you might need to get back on the air? I wish the preparation at the small market level were a lot better than it really is, but considering you don't have to keep a 50,000 watt transmitter powered up, it's probably not as much of a challenge as it is in a market like Chris is dealing with on a regular basis.
I want to follow up on what you said about engineers cooperating. And when engineers cooperate behind the scenes, do you think the managers and owners are always aware of that?
They're not always aware, but I do believe that they're always supportive, because my competitor was not a good person. The guy was just not a good person. And he even lowered himself to calling me a couple of times and asking me for help. And again, when it got out on the street and competing for audience, I mean, may the better guy win, and blood is not too high of a price to pay if it's necessary. But when it came to the engineering issues, I think they get it. I think they get it, because the shoe can be on the other foot, and you better think about that.
Chris, what's the New York City environment like for cooperation?
The engineering community in New York City, both television and radio, work together. All of us, we all know each other. We all have experienced similar situations where we needed help. For many years at the Empire State Building, I could say that the FMs, we all had the same model transmitters. So we actually had a room in one of the FM stations, had a spare closet, and we all chipped in and bought spare parts. And this way, if we had a problem, we just went into the room. We all had a key. You grabbed what you needed, and you replaced it. So you needed a tube, transformer, a capacitor, whatever was necessary for critical parts of your transmitter. You did it. Over the years, transmitters have changed, and now you can, get so much for those, so much competition. It's not the same. But that camaraderie from 15, 20 years ago has been handed down and continues to this day. Is the competition fierce in New York City? Absolutely. Some of the general managers of the stations probably, if they found out that their engineering staff was helping the competitor, would they go crazy? Absolutely. Behind closed doors, though, you sit down with the manager and explain to them the situation, and you give a couple examples and say, hey, we could easily be in the same position because we do not have the preparations where we should because you chose not to spend the money. So, when you start putting the revenue and putting dollars to things that make sense in their language, their world, they step back and go, okay, fine, just let's keep it so that they don't, and there's always that professional courtesy. You make sure they don't see things and understand what you're doing, so you keep everybody at arm's length on that. But yeah, New York City, the surrounding area, very competitive on one side of the fence, but when it comes to a situation like this weekend with Sandy, definitely if somebody called for help, nobody would have a problem going out and doing it.
I'm sure that on an upcoming episode of This Week in Radio Tech, we're going to hear back from Tom Ray. He'll be back with us when his emergencies are over, and he'll get to show us some pictures, maybe some video, and explain in pretty much detail what has been happening in the New Jersey Meadowlands, where they've gotten so much water on up into transmitter sites. I was in touch with Tom a couple of times during this, and he'll have some stories to tell. We're going to continue This Week in Radio Tech, episode 143. In just a couple of minutes. We're going to talk with Mike Phillips, our guest, and also with Chris Tobin, one of our regular co-hosts, about what you'd want to do for looking forward to the next emergency, and what kind of maybe relationships you want to try to form if you don't have them now with other engineers that are in your market or manufacturers. That brings up another good point, and we ought to talk about a bit since both Chris Tobin and I are in the manufacturing end of things. What can manufacturers do or offer to make things better for broadcasters who find themselves in a world of hurt? But first, we're going to talk about our sponsor for today's show, and that's Telos Systems and the Telos Zip One. The Zip One, Zip stands for Zephyr IP. The name Zephyr has been synonymous with getting audio, good quality, high quality stereo audio from here to there over digital phone lines for, my goodness, almost 2 decades now. Well, the Zip One carries that tradition forward into the IP world, the world of internet and private WANs and IP radios. The Zip One has got a list of features. Well, first of all, it's an IP codec, so it does audio coding and decoding at the same time. And it's connected to another Zip One or another NASIP compatible IP codec via some kind of IP connection. That could be the public internet. That could be a private wide area network. That could be an IP radio getting the data from one point to another. The point is it would need to be an IP connection, which are becoming so ubiquitous. It also has wireless capabilities. It will do Wi-Fi. In fact, every Zip One comes equipped with a Wi-Fi stick. It'll connect to open Wi-Fi networks and also to encrypted Wi-Fi networks as well. The one thing that the folks at Telos, the R&D guys, really put a lot of work into, and they work closely with the Fraunhofer company in Germany to develop this, and that is what's called agile connection technology. Now, in most cases, when you have an IP codec, you have to provision the bit rate and the buffering time at the receive end to always be within the capabilities of your IP connection, and that would be within the lowest capabilities of your IP connection. So if you've got an IP connection that hey, maybe overnight works great, but during the morning hours or afternoon hours it slows down a bit, or the latency becomes higher, or the jitter becomes higher, well, you've got to basically set your IP codec to handle those lowest available standards. Well, the Zip One is different. The Zip One has the ability to automatically adjust the buffer size at the receive end, and the bit rate at the send end. You see, the two zips talk to each other twice a second, checking on the round trip time, the amount of jitter and latency, and whether or not any packets have been dropped. And so that's called Agile Connection Technology, and the Zip 1 has this built in. It's very smart, and it works with all of the Fraunhofer codecs that are in there. So a wide variety of codecs, depending on what do you like. We tend to like AAC ELD because it can operate at a low bit rate and still sounds very good, plus it's low delay. There's also AAC HE, AAC low delay, MPEG layer 2. This makes it compatible with a lot of other codecs on the market. MP4 AAC low complexity. There's also MPEG 2 as the carrier, AAC low complexity. G711, which means, hey, it's got a SIP capability built in. You can tell it to go register with a SIP server and call it with a telephone if you need to do that. It'll also do G722 with that same SIP connection. And if you've got the bandwidth, the Zip 1 will do linear PCM as well. Lots more features, including end-to-end contact closures, RS-232 data from end-to-end, automatic redial. It memorizes the coding per buddy, per phone book entry. One rack unit form factor. Hey, and it's not even very expensive. Check it with your your favorite dealer, your favorite Telos dealer, or the Telos website at telos-systems.com. All right. Oh, there's also a short video on the website you may want to check out. It's me describing how to get your Zip 1 started up really quickly and make your first high-quality IP call to Telos. And here's some audio there. All right. We're in the middle of episode 143 of This Week in Radio Tech. And let's bring Mike Phillips back in the conversation. Mike,
yes.
Thinking about broadcasters, okay, Sandy's come through. A lot of broadcasters dodged a bullet here. A lot of broadcasters are feeling a lot of pain. But no matter what situation you're in, what are some things that broadcasters ought to be thinking about for the future? We got winter coming on. In some parts of the U.S., the southern tier of states, for example, we're getting into the midst of some of the prime tornado season for Mississippi, southern Georgia, southern Alabama, for example. What are some things that broadcasters ought to be doing to prep themselves?
In my opinion, the analysis is actually quite simple. You start at the microphone. What if you lose the microphone? What are you going to do? Well, you've got a spare. What if your console goes out? All right, now what about your processing? Now we get to the serious stuff. What about your transmitter? What happens if you lose your tower? You need to have a contingency plan for each one. And a lot of it varies, I guess, to some extent based on whether you're AM or FM, on whether your studio is located at the tower site or whether there's an STL. I mean, I've seen so many stations that, particularly years and years ago in this area, they would have full studios at the tower site because those days they would depend on telephone lines and things of that nature to get the signal from the studio back to the tower, so they could not depend on being disconnected during the times of these problems. So, I mean, the analysis is pretty simple. The issue is how do you dedicate enough financial resources to solving the problem? How do you have a spare AM tower? You can't. So the contingency plan has to be, whom do you know in the tower business that if a tornado knocks down your tower, you're going to get some consulting engineer over there to take a guy wire from the tower and create a long wire antenna unit such that someone has to have an impedance bridge or know really well how to come in and set up an ATU so your transmitter can broadcast with a guy wire as its antenna. Wow. What if the transmitter dies? I mean, a lot of the transmitters and I was laughing sort of when Chris was talking about his ideal setup, where you have all of these arch-rival competitors cooperating and having the same model of transmitter on the same site so that you have this some level of redundancy and even backup parts. Well, let me tell you, in the small markets, these stations are using the transmitters that Chris has thrown out as being obsolete. I mean, this is all that some of these small markets can afford. So what happens if you've got to replace that transmitter? I mean, back in the old days, remember, Kirk, you might have to wait 6 weeks to order a crystal for a transmitter. So how do you get a spare? You can't go get a spare. You can dial them in on some of the newer transmitters. You can program the frequency into them, but the old ones were not that way. So you'd better have a backup transmitter, and now because you can find one cheap. I mean, there's no reason not to have one in a way of switching it over. Who's going to switch it over? Who's going to be available? In terms of processing, you can go on the air without a processor. You can hook a Mackie mixer in straight into the input of a transmitter if you have to get on the air. So I think that the analysis in creating a checklist of what to do, I don't think that's very challenging. I think the solutions are where you have to get creative.
That's a real. You made some really good points there. And as a small market broadcaster myself, working on shoestring budgets often all the time in Mississippi and even in American Samoa. You don't throw much out. You keep everything you can and collect other people's cast-offs. Chris, in New York City, knowing now what we know, and about the long length loss of power, loss of probably lots of things like T1 lines and internet connections. And I'm not trying to lead your comment down a particular path here, but I guess what I'm looking at is, what do you think New York stations are thinking about doing differently when this all is over with and they're all back to normal?
Well, I would say, from what I know, without divulging trade secrets, most of the stations, and as earlier in Scott Fybush's comments, Clear Channel, the CBS stations, Cumulus here in town, have very robust, I will call them broadcast continuity systems. And despite the power outage that's currently taking place in Lower Manhattan, the generators are running. They're designed to run for a spell. They're maintained and done. You do all the preventive maintenance to make sure you're ready for the days like today, or this weekend, that is. Their interconnectivity is based on some wireless. There are several ways to do it, and one or two of the sites do have direct line of sight, believe it or not, to the Meadowlands, so they're not relying on an intermediary hop, say Empire State Building. And also, even if you have to rely on the Empire State Building, if you're fortunate enough, which most broadcasters are, and you have windows that look either north or south, east or west, to your transmitter sites and studios, if you properly manage the budget, you can put together a battery backup for your relay of your STL to and from. So you're not committed to the grid within the building. Within the Empire State Building.
That's pretty interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right in that relay. I guess a more power hungry relay might be one that's done with 950 megahertz receivers and transmitters. You might end up consuming close to 80, 90, 100 watts with a simple relay like that.
Yeah. Well, there are technologies today, and they're relatively, I'll say, affordable. Relatively affordable if you're smart about how to do it. Remember, we'll use the example, Empire State Building's 1,200 feet above sea level, so you don't need 40 watts, 25 watt Mosley, or a TFT to get connected to your transmitter site. So if you're doing 5.8, the 5.8 gig IP radios, I had a 9-mile shot from my studio to transmitter, atop of our office building to the transmitter site, and we ran it at approximately, I think it was 100 milliwatts.
Yeah.
What I did was I oversized the dishes, the 5.8 gig dishes on both ends, increased my link budget, and even during the heaviest rains and the highest fog levels across the Hudson River, we maintained 2 T1s to the studio and transmitter. And during the blackout of years ago, what was it, 2006? I forget what it was. We were up and running, independent of the grid.
Chris, I know both of us work for companies that make IP codecs, and we're kind of big fans of that technology because we see how versatile it can be. So I'm thinking about, I've never done a budget for something like a low power or inexpensive IP radio, and I'm thinking of the ones from Ubiquiti because those have become very popular among IT professionals and among some radio station guys. I know of Ubiquiti IP radios that are in use in some of the biggest markets, either acting as a full-time STL or as a backup STL, as well as backing up other things too, like just general data and songs and spots, traffic logs and billing information being saved, say, at the transmitter site. What kind of energy budget do you have to set aside for something like one of these IP radios?
Well, it's really the formulas you use are no different than we would use, say, at 950, 450, 160. It's just the standard, whether you get forward gain of your antenna, the power, and then the Fresnel zones of your both receive and transmit sites. It's not much at all. I mean, there are formulas. There's actually, I think, several manufacturers, if you had purchased their radios in a wireless mode, they offer you the calculators already. It's a simple program. And what you do is you just, where you can afford. Again, it's based on price budget as well. If you can afford a 2-foot dish, even though the link budget says you can get away with 1, do the 2. You've increased your safety margin. You can do 3, do 3. You've increased it even more. I'm not saying it's a linear improvement. Remember, it's doing RF, so it's a little logarithmic. It's not linear. And, these are things you can do. You can also, there are now new systems out there that run in a 950 slot. You can do digital in one direction. So, if you have a 950 link that you have enough room on either side of the carrier because of, if it's not too congested, you may be able to put a digital link out to your site and now put a couple of audio channels plus data out to your transmitter site to back up whatever you're doing. And if you want, you do the reverse. You just pick up another link. I think today we have more options than we did. As Mike pointed out, we have the telephone lines to transmitters. Back, when I was doing some stuff as an assistant back in 1984, 85, we had to rely pretty much on telco for everything. And what little we had as far as those days with the Mosley STLs back in the day, the PCL 505s, you were limited. It's different. Today, there's a lot of opportunity. And if you really are a radio station that serves the community and people really rely on you, you can still look at a satellite downlink portable KUs or a Inmarsat. There are companies that now you can purchase space segment, or I should say airtime, in advance at a very reasonable rate in the event of an emergency. They like people to buy in advance, so it's good for them. But you can do that, and now you've got yourself a link back to your transmitter site, and you can be anywhere.
With those kind of links, could you reliably and affordably get say 64 kilobits per second or 128 kilobits per second of data through?
Yeah. Inmarsat has the BGAN service, and then who's the other company? There's 2 other companies that do it. There are folks in Europe that do it now, and I've bumped into folks here in the States that are using it for news coverage. They actually plop it out. I've used it myself. I can attest to my personal use of these units, and we've done 64K, 128. You can do bonding, and now they're actually creating an IP link. It's intended for Ethernet over the satellite. There are ways to do it. Now, again, as Mike pointed out, some stations, they're operating with transmitters that, as he put it, where I worked and others worked, we sort of discarded because it met its life expectancy. It's not impossible. There are ways to do things today. You just got to be a little creative and think out of the box. I've helped Chris, a few folks do it. It works.
Chris, I'm going to want to get a final comment from you, because you've been a proponent and believer in some of the terrific cellular services that have been offered. I know that you've done a lot of work with the guys at Verizon and working with them to have products that work well with broadcast gear. So I want to ask you about that in just a minute. First, let's get back to Mike Phillips. Mike, in smaller markets, you said you're in North Carolina. What have you found during times of emergency about things that you can count on and things you can't count on? In other words, is it really important, or is it critical, necessary for a station to not be dependent upon a phone company, if at all possible? What's been your experience there?
Absolutely, because it's that same sense of urgency. I mean, we go into a panic over 3 seconds of dead air, and the telephone guys, I've had emergency situations where these guys would go to lunch, and they just don't have the sense of urgency, and it's not their fault. That's just not the business that they're in. So, one thing about broadcast engineers, when it comes to emergency situations, they are some of the most creative people you could possibly meet. It's absolutely amazing with some of the solutions they can come up with when they're put under the gun. It's just been fascinating to watch. I was thinking of a situation where a transmitter went off the air, and some guys were going through it, trying to find it, and finally a guy came in and discovered that it was a bad Zener diode in the screen supply to one of the modulator tubes. And unfortunately, it was like a 20-watt Zener diode.
Wow.
So there's not one of those in small market USA. So this guy was able to take a 1-watt Zener diode, connect the base to the collector of a 20-watt TO3 transistor, put it in there, and it's probably still in there. That was 20 years ago. So you have to be creative. You just never know what's going to be available.
It is amazing what people will end up using to fix something. We'll get to Chris in a second, but it brought to mind this story. I was in France actually just outside of the city of Le Mans, where they run the Le Mans race. I'm sure I've told this story before, but they had an Italian 1 kilowatt FM amplifier that had not worked in probably years. And they said, Kirk, can you fix this amplifier? And I said, well, do you have a manual for it? Oh, no, we don't have a manual. And if we did, it would be Italian. Okay, fine. So I open it up and just look for anything that's obviously wrong. Well, there are some traces that are burned up. And the company that built it had used a metal standoff, one of these hexagonal shaped standoffs that's male threaded at one end and has a female threading it on the other end. And they were using that to hold two circuit boards together, stiffening them, but also they were running current through this thing from one board to another. It was a connection. And so I gave this thing a good look, and I said, okay, here's what I need. I need a paper clip, and I'm going to need more solder, and I think I said I need some sandpaper to kind of clean things up. And so they went to the store, got the stuff, brought it back. I worked for maybe 45 minutes on this thing. Again, without having a manual, I had no idea if this was going to work. I just knew I'm fixing what's burned up. Put it all back together, put the top on it, plugged it in, turned on the exciter, turned on the amplifier, prayed a little bit, and the amplifier, the meters went, putting out, a couple adjustments, a kilowatt. And they said, oh, you are MacGyver. You are MacGyver. Yes. Sometimes you have to get by with what you got. Okay, Chris, we've come to depend upon and really enjoy the convenience of mobile data. So what have you found in New York with regard to mobile data during this period?
Well, my worst nightmare has come to true this weekend with cellular. Well, it's to be expected. As Mike pointed out, the cellular industry is not sort of like as we are in broadcast or OEM operations in most municipalities. But if you're anywhere south of 39th Street here in New York City, your cell service is most likely spotty. I have two phones, actually three different phones with three different networks. And believe it or not, all three of them were going into search mode. At one point, I lost my 3G, 4G capability on one phone. And another one just was searching as I'm standing and walking along a street that I've done many times any other day of the week prior to this weekend. Reason being the phone cell sites, a lot of them got flooded out. They're on battery. Batteries are running out because they're not designed. They weren't designed for more than, say, several hours because they assumed either generator or power interruption would be restored. So to rely on cellular for emergencies, got to be very careful. If you're going to do that, I have to say, I remember years ago, back in Hurricane Gloria, I think it was. I actually worked at a radio station where we worked with the local amateur operators and used them as information relay points around the community. So we would station one of our folks at their control point. They would be out, so like what they do with the marathons and civic events where they come out and provide communications for nonprofit stuff. I believe there's still a provision in the rules for amateurs in the event of emergency life safety that they can work with commercial operators, not to use the frequencies commercially, but to assist in providing public safety. And we had used them as a way of getting information from the community and say, here's what's going on, here's this, here's that, and using our RPU frequencies, that was our link back to the studio. So, again, being creative is one way to do it. But with cellular, unfortunately, you're at the mercy of the phone companies. Unless you're working with them and they have designed their networks to be robust for mission-critical emergencies like this one this weekend, you're going to have to come up with other means to stay connected. Because I don't think what I saw this afternoon or this morning going around town and looking at my phone and the inability for a lot of people as I'm walking along the street, they're all standing there with their phones. They're trying to, figure out that I can't get something going on and doing this. I'm in downtown Manhattan on a sunny day and the cell service is down. What does that say? As Mike pointed out, it comes down to dollars and cents. Follow the money. If I'm Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, or Sprint, am I willing to build my sites with enough redundancy so if a hurricane force or gale, a category 2 or 3 hits a particular area that I survive it? I don't know.
This Chris, you and I know you've done a lot of work in providing remote reporter news coverage capabilities using cellular services, data services. And And normally that works fine. It's a great solution in the places that it works, which is many places, especially in the metropolitan area. But when there's a disaster like this, and you have even more need to get reports in from the field, you may very well probably have to use a different system. You got to have some backup to that, and we don't think about that so much, because that cellular service, that is a convenient thing, isn't it?
Well, it's convenient, and it comes down to cost. I mean, I have always been, and people who've worked with me know damn well, and I've said this for years and years, do not rely on your cellular phones during a crisis. That's like this one here. We've had a crisis here in New York City when there was a incident at the UN many years ago, people rioting and creating all kinds of political unrest. And as soon as the reporters showed up on site, the local law enforcement activated their cellular jamming systems, and this way avoided the rioters from being able to communicate, but also prevented us from doing our coverage, because that's what we relied on. Because why? People have decided that two-way radios are not sufficient or not efficient anymore. Well, that technology has changed. Now you can, with there's several systems out there that do digital communications, and if you're smart about it, again, willing to spend the money, you can come up with a very nice way of reporting and being connected and do what you have to do. But again, you got to rethink how you want to do it. But
that's interesting. That's interesting. I guess, especially in markets where you have a strong news station presence, maybe the two-way radio business isn't dead. You might need the services of these guys.
It's not dead. The two-way radio business is not dead, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, in the case of, say, an all-news facility, what is at the end of the day during a crisis? What are people looking for? Information. Your goal should be, what methods do I use to get the information to the end user? It doesn't matter whether it's cellular. If cellular's working that point in the town, great, use it. But do I have something else in my tool bag? No, I don't. You're screwed. And then what happens? At the end, the perception is, I tuned into those guys, but I didn't get anything out of it. I got more on Twitter than I did on my favorite radio station. What does that say? That's what it comes down to. I came back. I actually have a means to communicate with some friends using an IP for a ham radio, your D-Star and that stuff. I'm in San Francisco. I'm talking to people here in New York City. Moto Turbo is another digital system. Everything I did from San Francisco to keep in touch and to keep an ear and eye on what was going on around town was done with alternate means, never touching the cellular network. Now, again, like Mike pointed out, where he is, North Carolina, maybe it's maybe a Moto Turbo system makes sense. An RPU channel, digital. The audio quality is not that bad, but when you're in a crisis mode, the key is intelligibility. Do you want that muffled cellular phone audio that's all screwed up because it can't handle the complex sound of sirens in the background while you're at a fire or a building collapse? But a two-way radio is designed to be intelligible, and you can work with it. There's a lot of things. I think it's time to rethink. I'll call it old school approach. But a two-way radio, something as simple as this here. This is a two-way radio in my hand. The visually impaired, it's a Motorola handheld. And this radio has enough channel capacity and audio to be sufficient to cover what's going on. On this radio right now, I can talk to 4 different repeaters and cover all 5 boroughs. On Long Island, I can communicate with somebody, and in Westchester County, right from where I'm sitting. So think about it. Now, these are ham channels, ham frequencies. But broadcasters have access to UHF and a couple of VHF channels, and they're squandering them just for simple dispatch, if that. Think about it. It works.
Hey, there's a quick question from the chat room. How are the pirate stations in Brooklyn and Queens doing right now?
Some of them are off the air. They've lost power. There are some that are on. They may have been creative in using DC inverters on their car batteries. Keep power going. It's not impossible. I've done that. But there's a few on. There's a couple in Brooklyn. There's one in the Bronx. Actually, I just heard one this morning. Yeah.
Interesting. Hey, we've got some folks who have been listening to and watching this show on the GFQ network today that we don't normally have because we were on at an odd time. Normally, This Week in Radio Tech is on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central, 5 Pacific time. If you have enjoyed the show, if you're interested in catching it again, we'll be on our normal time next week, 8 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday night. You can, of course, subscribe to the show. Just go on the GFQ Network website. Just go find one of our episodes. There's links there to sign yourself up for downloads on iTunes or FeedBurner. You can listen to the audio, download the audio. You can watch the episode right there on the website. You might also, we don't put out very many tweets on it, so if you want to follow the Twert Show on Twitter, it's simply at Twert Show, TWIRT for This Week in Radio Tech. Twert Show. It's at Twert Show on Twitter. We have a Facebook page, too. If you just go to Facebook and search for This Week in Radio Tech or Twert, you'll probably find it soon enough. All right. Thanks for everybody for participating. And thanks, Mike Phillips from North Carolina, for jumping in here. Mike, I'd like to have you on for a whole show sometime in the future and reminisce about radio gear.
Oh, it's still a love of my life, Kirk, and I appreciate being here. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, thanks for being here on short notice and adding your comments. Chris Tobin, thank you. I know it had to be an effort for you to get on the air with us, but I appreciate it.
No, not at all. I've got power. I've got all my battery operated stuff. I'm set. I can manage. If we had a blackout, I can manage. I'm good.
All right. And also, thanks to Andrew Zarian at the GFQ Network for producing today's show. Appreciate that very much. Next week, I'm going to be live in the GFQ studios on Thursday nights, and maybe Chris Tobin will make the trip and be there with me. I don't know. That's up to
I will make the trip. I will make the trip.
All right. Well, I'll be glad to have you there. Our show's been brought to you by Telos Systems and the Telos Zip 1 IP codec. Go to the website, telos-systems.com, and check out the Zip 1 IP codec. We'll see you all next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye.
That's all the bandwidth we can pilfer this week. Another Twert has propagated, and all the transmitters and audio equipment live happily ever after, thanks to the handsome engineer and his kind, benevolent care. We'll be back next week.
Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
This Week in Radio Tech. Subscribe to iTunes and you'll never miss a show. Search for This Week in Radio Tech in the iTunes Store. Soliciting is strictly encouraged. If you like today's show, tell a friend. If you didn't like it, we were never here. Kirk Harnack's wardrobe provided by the Salvation Army and the Red Cross Disaster Relief Services. Hair and makeup provided by Penelope Garcia Hernandez Weinberg.
He's unique, wouldn't you say?
I just want to get it over with.
This ends this transmission. Tango, Whiskey, India, Romeo, Tango. Signing off. Okay.